Sisters Corner, the topical show where we talk about issues of relevance to Muslim women, all women, and actually anyone who cares about society. So welcome, it's great to be here with you on this February day. And today our subject matter is women and equality. Particularly we're focusing on the fact that 100 years last week, 6th of February, women in the United Kingdom were given the right to vote. It's fascinating, there's just so much to unpick around that, and it is a huge deal as well in terms of women's equality in this country. And with me to discuss this and lots of these issues around women's equality is Carol Worthington Hollowbread, who's a public servant who's been working many years in this area and working with lots of different women. But you're also an ex-policewoman as well.
I am.
So welcome, Carol. Thank you so much for making the time to come and see us.
Great to be here, thank you.
Fantastic. And so you used to work for a police force many years ago?
I did, yeah. I retired in 2015, so 3 years ago now since I retired. Right. But I worked for them for 18 years, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And so, in a way, you were one of the earlier, it wasn't always seen as a profession for women, really, was it, the police force?
It wasn't, no. When I joined back in 1996, about a third of the intake then were women. So we were starting to creep in. The intake before mine, which was 5 weeks before I started, they changed the system whereby all the women had different collar numbers. So everybody, all officers are identified by a collar number, they call it, because it's a number that you have on your collar. And all women were identified by a collar number that started with 5 in the force that I worked. But there was a woman who complained about that and said that it showed inequality in the force, and it was upheld. And so from the time that I started, we were all given the same collar number. So all starting then to treat women equally. But historically in the force, women would take on roles that were traditionally classed as women roles. So they would talk to victims of domestic violence and that sort of thing, and manage any sort of childcare issues, but basically be in the station, not go out and do patrols with the men at all.
So I definitely want to come back and talk to you a bit more about that actually, and what's changed in the last 100 years. And it's interesting there, the point you made was about a woman had to complain and raise her head above the parapet actually, and put herself forward to say it's not right. And that's actually what happened, you know. So 100 years ago, this is just a plotted history, and please, obviously, everybody go and do your own research. There's lots of information out there, there's lots of documentaries, and it's definitely worthwhile knowing some of this history. So 6th of February, 100 years ago, the Representation of the People's Act was passed. This gave some women, all men, the right to vote. It may seem unusual because we don't think as this country, because 100 years is still quite recent history, I think, as a country where women wouldn't have been given the right to vote. And although I'm saying given, and we can talk about this, there's some people saying actually the vote was taken, and it was because of the direct action of lots of women. Now you may have heard of them called suffragettes. So these are women who campaigned through various means, some of which, you know, was very peaceful, so letters, lobbying members of parliament, etc. Some of it was more direct action, so people were chaining themselves to railings, and some of it was actually what you would call possibly violent direct action, where women were actually blowing up, you know, things, which we don't advocate obviously, but there was definitely different elements, and people did lose their life, you know, in this process. A key thing to remember with this particular act at that time, it was another 10 years before all women were given the right to vote. And I was surprised actually, I didn't realise the stipulations, because basically on the 6th of February 100 years ago, it was women over 30, women who were married, women who had property or their family had property. So essentially what we were talking about is white middle class women who met those conditions could vote. And then it was another 10 years before all women from all backgrounds, regardless of social status or marital background, were able to vote. And that was all quite new to me as well, because I genuinely thought at the time, when everyone said it was everyone, it was all women. And I also didn't realise that up until that stage, in 1918, that all men couldn't, so working class men couldn't vote either. So the representation of the People's Act, we tend to celebrate it because it's about women's votes and suffrage, but actually it also was the time that all men from all backgrounds were given the vote. So were you aware, Carol, of the difference between a suffragette and a suffragist?
No, I wasn't. That's kind of new to me. Yeah.
This again, and this is really important because we don't learn this stuff in school. So this is things that I've learned in my adult life, and because I've been interested. But the difference between a suffragette and a suffragist. So a suffragette actually is remembered as someone who would use direct and possibly violent action, and a suffragist was one who used more peaceful or more pacifist ways. So the letters, the persuasion, the lobbying, the channeling for change in more peaceful ways, and that was the difference. And I think it's interesting because there's moves to pardon the suffragettes. Have you heard that at the moment? There's a bit of discussion that there's a call. Some people are saying the British government should pardon the suffragettes. So obviously some of them got arrested, and therefore have a criminal record. Most of them are not alive now, but you can get that criminal record expunged if you're exonerated. So if the classification of your crime is removed. What do you think of that?
I think, absolutely, and I think it's well deserved, because they fought for the rights for 50% of the population, 52% of the population, to have the same rights as the other 48%, i.e. the men. And they fought hard, and a lot of the women who were imprisoned were force-fed because they went on hunger strikes. And they went through a lot of trauma, and I can't remember the name of the lady who ran out in front of the King's horse, but
Dickinson?
Yes, that's the one. But she died, obviously, and they did horrendous things. When I say horrendous, really things that were really difficult physically for them to suffer and to go through. But they did that so that we could have the same rights as men. And it started us on the road of getting the same rights. We're still working on it at the moment, but it was definitely the start of things, and they just worked so hard, and they deserve to have the criminal records expunged, definitely. Posthumously, even so, because as you say, they all are long gone now, but their family is still here, and it's a mark for their family and for the work that they did for society.
It's interesting because the other side of that angle, which, I'm not sure where I come down on this yet myself, but there is also another faction, if you like, at the moment, who think they shouldn't be exonerated, not because they don't deserve the dignity, etc., but because then it almost lets off the government, and it looks like the vote was given as opposed to taken, and won and fought for, with life and limb, actually. And therefore it's almost like you whitewash history. So if you now go back and say, oh, well, we gave you the vote, and, it makes it look, it's the right thing, and it happened eventually, and it happened through the change in law, etc. But that element of whether, violent action is ever justified, and should you whitewash it or not whitewash it, and and I'm not sure, because I think there's arguments on both sides, isn't there? And if someone did have their criminal record cleared, would that make the actions any less powerful?
I think on that question, no, I don't think so, because I think what they did stands out in history. But I understand absolutely what you say about criminal records and about violent action, and it's a very, very difficult boundary, isn't it? You could say, well, any political organisation, because effectively they were a political organisation, fight for what they think is to be right. And many people who fight, whether it be for religious or political reasons, we might call terrorists, and want to lock them all up and throw away the key, as some people do. I can't say I necessarily stand on those grounds, but it is a very difficult line to draw. Where do you draw the line on what is acceptable behaviour? But I think at the end of the day, if you look at the suffragettes and what they went through, they put themselves in a lot of danger, and they did a lot of hurt physically to themselves. They didn't physically hurt other people. And maybe there's an argument for a boundary being drawn there. I don't know. It's it's one of those discussions that will go on and on and on, and I think everybody will be on one side of the fence and then jump to the other side of the fence and then maybe sit on the fence for a while, and because it's very difficult, and when you start to draw boundaries on subjects like that, it's very, very difficult.
I mean, I personally am a pacifist, so I really don't believe in the use of violence. But I suppose there is something about harm to self and harm to others. I didn't realise this, but there is, and we'll have this all up and down the country. Museums will have artefacts from that time, and we had one here in Bradford, and one of the artefacts was a hat pin, and they were really long. Really fascinating things, but apparently they were used either as lockpicks or they were used, you know, if they were being held down, or if the women were being held down or suppressed in some way, that they would jab usually the police officer actually trying to hold them down to, you know, give them wiggle room to get away. So I do think it is fascinating history, and I think the other thing, and I say history, but it is our history because it's a privilege. And one thing that occupies my mind a bit, Carol, is the bravery of those women to go against society, because they will have been going against their families as well in some cases. So there will have been elements of their family saying, don't be silly, you know, this is just stupid, and don't pursue these ideas, and they're too modern and they're too newfangled, and you know, their husbands and the dads will have been, you know, going down that road. And don't get me wrong, I know absolutely there were a lot of men, and you can see them in the pictures from that time actually, who supported the movement as well. So it wasn't all, this isn't an anti-man thing at all. It is just about the way the law has evolved over time in this country.
But there was an awful lot of antagonism against it by women as well. So whilst there were men who supported what the suffragettes were doing, there were women who were very much against it. I don't understand where they were coming from personally, but then maybe that's just me living in this society, and maybe if you were brought up in a different society as it was then. But it was a very, very patriarchal society. Men made the rules, men made the laws, and that's why the working class men didn't get the vote, because the men who stood in Parliament and who sat in the House of Lords were the higher class men. And
maintaining their power.
Absolutely.
I think we've got a call, Carol. Let me just see who's online. Oh, hello?
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Welcome to the show, sister.
Jazakallah khair. I'd just like to say that the women need to stand up for their justice, because the thing is, in our society, they're going through culture and not the actual religion. In religion, God gives you equality, and then they're not looking at what the models of life is, and then what they're doing is just fighting with their name or pride, and all it is culture fighting. And then we ladies need to speak out. I mean, I'm born and bred here, but our cultures don't understand. Education needs to be put back into the society, and the basic aspects is in the books of the holy books. It already says that you treat each equality, you know, each other equally.
Absolutely. So thank you, sister. Your point is really well made. Actually, you know, as you rightly say, in history, 1400 years ago, Islam gave women so many rights: the right to have property, the right to an education, you know, the right to have a say in who they marry, etc. So, alhamdulillah, you know, so much was given to us, and that was set up equally for men and women to follow. And if you remember, at the time, there was a practice called infanticide, so where people would actually murder their female children because they considered them a burden, and Islam, you know, by the grace of Allah, was there to release us of that, you know, awful period. The point about culture and religion is absolutely spot on, and I think Carol and I will definitely discuss it a bit further, and thank you for your comments. It's actually, yes, we've on one hand we had the man-made law here, and that we're talking about, that was to give women equality, and on the other hand we had, you know, God-given law for equality. But the thing at the heart of all this is what you were just starting to talk about, is what do those in power do with that, you know, and how do they do that? So thank you, sister. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and please do join us later as well if you like. So what do we make of that then? So we've got, on one hand, we've got a law, 100 years old. On the other hand, you know, as the sister was referring to, is that we have an organised religion, and obviously with divine intervention, rights given to women. But fast forward 1400 years, fast forward 100 years, what's changed? Do we really have equality for women?
We have a lot more equality for women than we did 100 years ago, definitely. But we're not there yet. And there's still an element that this is still a patriarchal society.
And just quickly say what we mean by patriarchy.
It means it's led by men.
Yeah, it's
basically it's a male-dominated society, and I think sort of going back in the history of this country and looking at the Christian tradition, basically goes back to Genesis in the Bible, where God made man, and then from a rib of Adam's he made Eve, and Eve is seen in the Christian Christian religion really to be subservient to Adam, and therefore women are seen as subservient to men, and it has always been that way. And that's why in this country we've always had that patriarchal society, and it's been developed by, as I was saying earlier, by men who have power, so men who have money, and through many of the years, going back to Victorian times, there were landowners and there were peasants who worked on the land, and the peasants would have to go to church every Sunday, and they would be preached at in church and told how sinful they were, and what they had to work so hard to have their sins forgiven, and it's all very much of a power thing, and it's kind of where culture meets religion really, and where that power from men has been brought down to the working class man and down to women as well, and men have always controlled, they made the laws. So you look at society now, and women now, although we have more autonomy and we have more equality, still we're working within the laws that men made and within a society that men created, and it is not easy.
And it's not easy because, like you said, definitely things that have changed in the last 100 years in the UK. Women can drive, women can go to work, women can have an education, they can be the Prime Minister, you know, so all of that on the surface of it looks very different. However, when you then look at women in education, so generally more women now go to university than definitely 100 years ago. And yeah, when women enter the workforce, their progression routes are slower, so they don't get into the top jobs. So you might have more women entering, you know, professional areas, but they won't get to the top jobs very soon. And usually that's, you know, men or younger men who are literally skipping past them on the way there. So this thing about the glass ceiling is definitely there. So women are presenting themselves, if you like, with all the skills and qualities and talent they have, but that's not necessarily being followed through. And when it does, and we've seen it recently, you know, with some of the big media corporations, the unequal pay. So we've had, you know, Equal Pay Act in this country for, oh God, the 70s, I think.
The 70s, yeah.
And actually, this day and age in 1918, sorry, in 2018, here in the United Kingdom, we are still having women doing exactly the same job or a comparable job as men and earning, you know, a lot less. And we're not just talking 1 or 2 pennies less. Sometimes it can be, you know, as much as 50%. So that's absolutely, well, I think, deplorable, actually. But,
and you still get women who, when they go for a job interview, being asked whether they are intending to have a family, and it's not lawful anymore to ask those questions, but they still do, and you have to surmise that if they're going to ask those questions, then that is going to have an influence on whether they get the job or not. And you get women who leave work to have a break from work to have children, and find that their job's not there when they finish, or they don't get progress up the ladder, because they're likely to be having a family, and that's so wrong. But take out the issue of having the family, and as you say, women just don't progress up that ladder for whatever reason. The ceiling was put there by men. Businesses are run on this sort of patriarchal line whereby it's you start at the bottom, there's people working down at the bottom, and then there's sort of like the ladder going on up. I think if women designed businesses, it would be much more of a community-led thing, and the workers would make decisions between them. It would be a very, very different workplace.
More collaborative.
Yeah.
When you start that, Carol, I'll come and work with you.
Yeah.
That'll be nice, won't it? And what's also interesting to me is, I know we've said voting here has been 100 years. It's also still quite recent, you know. And I was quite surprised, and I can't remember the names, but there are quite a few Scandinavian countries where voting actually for women isn't 100 years old. You know, it's more recent, and which I found really surprising, considering that, you know, if you think about India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, so if we think about human rights and we think about equality for women, those are not necessarily the countries we think at the top of the list, if you like, but they've all had female heads of state, and before the UK, you know, and before many other what we might in other circumstances call developed countries. Yet again, and it comes partly down to cultural practices and different societal norms and structures. If you go to a village in one of those places, chances are, not everyone at all, chances are that that woman would have very few rights, you know, so she may be cared for and looked after and provided for. Would she be able to leave the home to get an education if she chose? Unfortunately, not in many cases. Would she be able to work outside of the home? And it's that thing about choice. So where women choose not to, I have sisters who don't work and they choose not to, and their families are able to provide and they work that out between themselves. You know, alhamdulillah, by the grace of God, that's perfectly acceptable. There is real choice involved, and that's important. But that's the question is, do we? And I think one of the things is we have women in this country, and again, when we think about media portrayal of Muslim women, they're the oppressed ones, etc., etc. But actually, if you think of some of the women in our poorer working class white estates, the expectations of them and their self-expectations, they're not that different, are they?
No,
you know?
no. I mean, you could say that they are very oppressed, maybe in a slightly different way, but they are, and they're ruled by, or governed. Their life is governed by the number of jobs that they have and supporting their children, and I've come across a lot of these families when I was working in the police service, and they live very difficult lives, a lot of them. They work, you know, they get up early hours and they come back, take the children to school, and then go back out to work again, you know, and they work so many hours for pittance, an absolute pittance. And then, you know, you look at men who generally don't have the childcare responsibilities as well, but taking on maybe sort of roles that might be classified as more male gendered roles, so not so much the cleaning, you know, office cleaning, but you know, other jobs, and they are better paid. And you think, well, how can this be? It just doesn't seem right at all. And so yes, you know, we do have more equality than we did have, but there's a huge long way to go.
I was just going, there's a long way. I mean, if you look at, in this country, we've got a female Prime Minister, but then again, and we've got a more balanced cabinet perhaps than before, but you know, there is that. We're sat in Bradford, and the local authority here has about a third female representation in the elected on the elected membership, but that obviously could be better, and it's milestones, isn't it? And this is, well, when you start getting a little bit disheartened, I think you have to think about it as milestones. We're on a journey, we're going to have to actually stop that journey just for a moment, because we're going to go to a break, and inshallah we'll see you and speak with you hopefully. Do call in if you'd like to join the conversation in a minute or so. Thank you.